Welcome to Season 4, Episode 9 of Solarpunk Presents, in which I interview our very own Ariel Kroon, because she is a deep font of wisdom about post-apocalyptic and apocalyptic, I would imagine, science fiction.
Well, I don't know about wisdom, but I'll try my best.
Oh, well, I have so many questions. So even though this is kind of the opposite of Solarpunk, it's also kind of useful to explore through a Solarpunk lens.
Also, this research is sort of what led me to Solarpunk. Well, I mean, Solarpunk is something that I came to separately, but then I realized by the end of writing this dissertation that the two worlds were converging.
So let's see what we end up learning about Solarpunk by exploring Solarpunk's evil twin, unlike Lunarpunk, which is its artsy-fartsy twin. So, so let me just throw out the first question to get this started. What is the purpose of post-apocalyptic fiction?
Oh, starting us off with a real softball question, I see. I couldn't tell you objectively what the purpose of post-apocalyptic fiction is. I can only tell you from my subjective opinion as someone who has researched it, but I believe that the purpose of post-apocalyptic fiction is very similar to the purpose of fantasy fiction. It's escapism. Not entirely. I mean, it also articulates a specific desire. This theorist called Frederick Kreuziger, who's a religious scholar, he brought together the religious genre of the apocalyptic, so like Revelations, the Book of Daniel, that sort of stuff, and the sci-fi iteration of the apocalyptic back in 1982, and theorized about what he calls the desire for apocalypse, which is a desire for a world that is the same, but different. Basically, the desire is for the human structures of society, politics, economics, government, social mores, etc., to suddenly be wiped away, and this gives a measure of freedom to the individual, akin to the way that explorers and travelers centuries ago were able to exercise a measure of freedom away from society. They can go to new places where most things were different. What stays the same in the post-apocalypse is the basic fundamental laws of nature, or the way that we understand the world to work. So like gravity is not suddenly different, and there's still a mixture of oxygen and other gases in the atmosphere that make it habitable for humans, for example.
Oh, so I feel stupid because even though the word apocalypse, that comes, yeah, that's a religious term, and I somehow
Mhm.
didn't really join those dots together before.
In Greek, it's apocalypsis and it means revelation. So basically, an apocalypse just means something gets revealed. What we have come to think of the apocalypse is that what gets revealed is the real way that people relate in a desperate situation. There's tons of violence, like sort of all of these niceties of civilization are kind of stripped away. And, we have to deal with nature red in tooth and claw. And, it's a very, Thomas Hobbes was a philosopher, but it's a very Hobbesian view of humanity where life is, he said something like brutal, nasty, and short,
Oh
which,
yeah, right, that guy.
yeah, it's not true. Um,
It
but
depends on where you live, I suppose.
I mean, it has been the dominant strain in how Western philosophy has thought of human life and human relationships, especially political relationships, for the past, I don't know, couple of centuries, and has shaped a whole lot of the way that history has gone, unfortunately. I was going to say, the post-apocalyptic, in that way, is kind of an expression of the human desire to explore, which is corrupted in its expression by the colonial desire to conquer. So I don't think the exploration urge is a bad one, but when there's a desire to suddenly claim that explored land as your own, or to establish your own little society with rules that you're the main arbiter and enforcer of, do you see where I'm going with this? It's
Well,
kind of
I'm kind of
not a
seeing
great thing.
how convenient apocalypse is if it wipes out, all the people who live there
Oh, it's
before you go
extremely
in and explore.
convenient. Religious apocalypse is basically the Deus ex machina, like example. Like it's the like divine intervention that suddenly makes things super different in a positive way for some people who can take advantage of that situation.
Second question. And I guess you've touched on some of this already, but why are post-apocalyptic stories so darn fun? Like way more fun than pretty much the entire canon of utopian science fiction. Is it because we like to dream about ourselves as heroes who will rise to the occasion against tyranny? Or are we mainly fascinated with the starting over from a blank slate? Or is it something else entirely?
So what I found through my research is that the answer to that question tends to change depending on who's writing the story and what they're trying to do with the post-apocalypse. I've read some pretty dismal post-apocalyptic science fiction because the authors were intentionally trying to illustrate to their audience that it's not all machine guns in the mall with a horde of zombies. And I'm just going to pause here to reiterate that I studied post-apocalyptic literature published between 1949 and 1989. So any references that I make to like post-apocalyptic movies and contemporary fiction, they're going to be kind of sus. But back to fun. I think in answer to your first question, so like why are post-apocalyptic stories so fun versus utopian stories? It's because the majority of post-apocalyptic fiction focuses on individual characters and their actions, whereas traditionally the majority of utopian stories have focused on changes in society and how they contrast with that society at the time. The utopian genre, for better or worse, has up until recently been pretty didactic.
That means intended for instruction, or inclined to teach or lecture others too much.
And thus kind of dry. Whereas the post-apocalyptic starts with a base axiom of deep and terrible tragedy, which is like A+ character backstory already. We're already kind of hooked. The reader either wants to know how society fell or how it will fall, and how the protagonist that the author is hopefully setting us up to empathize with will deal with it. Because the post-apocalyptic story is a story about a person and not a setting. We, the readers, are able to extrapolate and think about what we would do if we were in that situation. So it's automatically more relatable. About dreaming about ourselves as heroes rising up against tyranny, well, that actually relates to my research findings about specifically Canadian narratives of post-apocalyptic science fiction versus American narratives, which became the dominant Hollywood expression of what we now think of when we think of the post-apocalyptic. So Americans rise to the occasion. As John Flute says, when you read American sci-fi, you're on the right side and you're going to win. Whereas Canadian sci-fi has historically had a penchant to depict its heroes as losers with occasional wins, or the major characters likely no better off or even worse off or like dead at the end of the story. So this trend kind of mirrored world politics sort of at that time. So the Americans were the protagonists, the Soviets were the enemies, and the Canadians were kind of also there.
Okay.
So a lot of Canadian narratives actually aren't about someone rising to occasion. Because if a nuclear war happened, we'd kind of be helpless to stop it, but just as affected as America.
Okay, so you're telling me that this old-time Canadian post-apocalyptic fiction isn't fun.
Not really, no.
Okay, oh gosh, only question 3 here. So tell me, what does apocalyptic science fiction have to do with white cis-het male supremacy?
Okay, this is a huge and complicated topic, but I'm just going to focus on a few aspects. And the first of that is the gender binary. So our ideas of how women and men act, think, relate, dress, believe, what they can do, all of that adhere to stereotypes about gender that are pretty baked into our worldviews at this point, because a lot of it goes back centuries, even millennia. So of course, it's an easy shorthand for writers to use when fleshing out their characters. It's sort of in the back of our minds, and since specific aspects of how gender is performed can be culturally specific, it's a very good bet that any writer who grew up in that particular society will write what they know. So it's just that anyone who tended to know about the other sex for the past few centuries tended to rest on well-worn stereotypes because women and men lived in very separate cultural spheres. So the whole like, women are like this, men are like that, like it becomes an easy way to characterize your protagonist by saying they are a female and thus they like these things and they do these things and this is their situation in life, or they are a guy and this is their particular class and you know exactly what his aspirations are and where the story might take him. It's, in my opinion, very lazy writing, but it saves people a lot of rambling, like what I'm doing right now.
Oh, okay, so
Like the second aspect that I wanted to sort of talk about in this answer to this question
okay.
is sort of what you mentioned earlier about like starting over from blank slate in terms of society. So like, are you familiar with the conservative line of thinking that there are just too many rules to follow in society right now that's preventing these conservative people from speaking their mind?
Oh no, actually, I'm blissfully unaware. I am blissfully unaware of that.
Oh, I get a lot of people complaining at me that there's too many woke restrictions on their behavior. We're all in this woke society now, and you can't say anything, and you can't make any jokes, and you know, like blah
I would
blah.
introduce those people to the Puritans.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is a dominant strain of conservative talking points here and in Britain.
Yeah, but it's just an excuse, right? It's just
Oh yeah,
political game playing, right? Because they're
yeah,
perfectly
yeah,
happy to cancel other people and censor other people, right? It's just part of the game that they play. And
yeah.
maybe they even believe what they say, but somewhere the person who got the ball rolling knew exactly what kind of game they were playing with that.
Yeah, I think so. But like again, it's sort of like playing on those sort of baked in gender stereotypes. So they think that women are naturally one way and men are naturally another, and they bemoan the fact these categories have been transgressed. So the logic of like trans exclusive radical feminists is that there are too many kids and people these days who are acting sort of like against nature, or like I am willing to bet that a lot of political rhetoric in Germany is about how there's too many immigrants.
Yeah, well, I mean, not across the board, but coming from the far right.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, it's all part of that desire for apocalypse. So many people who think that way would rejoice if society as we knew it was somehow dismantled or wiped out so that the quote unquote laws of nature could reassert themselves and things could quote unquote go back to the way they're supposed to be. So I'm using a lot of quotes here because actually things that we think are natural, like class hierarchies, economic systems, gender roles, and racial categories, are actually all made up human constructions that don't actually have any real basis in nature. So feminist philosopher Rosie Briotti's book, The Post-Human, is actually pretty good at explaining this. But like in a nutshell, in the Enlightenment in Europe, only white upper class English men were considered to be truly human. Not that they would have said that out loud, or maybe they would have. But everyone else was not part of that category of human. So women, children, poor people, queer people, brown people, foreign people, even like other Europeans. Like the first race science was actually Englishmen trying to prove that Irish people, like the Celtic race, were not actually human and that they were closer to monkeys than anything else. And so they could
I have
exploit.
actually known a few Brits who still subscribe to
Yeah, yeah.
that.
It was really
They
prevalent.
all live in caves and eat turnips.
Yeah, and like somehow the French were Celtic too, because they wanted to justify that sort of like age-old, like, you know, like English-French rivalry. And like I don't remember the reasons why the French were also Celtic. But a lot of what I studied was
Well,
creative
they
development, and I've tried to sort of like shunt a lot of it out of my brain.
okay. I mean, they do still have a Celtic enclave in northwestern France,
Hmm. Okay, all right. Well,
in Brittany. It's
oh,
still fairly
interesting.
Celtic. They still the language that some of the people still speak there is so close to the various sorts of Gaelic that you know, the someone who speaks Breton can probably still speak with someone in Cornwall who speaks Cornish, even though
See,
they're
that's really, really cool. But I mean, back then it was like a real bad thing. So, like society at large admitted that white women were probably human when the first wave feminists proved that they would actually rather die than live without the same rights as men. And in the 60s and 70s, where there was like kind of a grudging kind of extension of humanity to Black people and brown people, and like I say society because we all know individuals who have differing opinions on those sorts of things. And however, all those people who kind of want to go back to the natural state of things tend to really mean this relatively recent invention of who gets to be human according to British Enlightenment standards. And they might not even consciously realize this to be the case, but those phrases are dog whistles for the sentiment of wanting to live in a world where some humans have the ability to dominate others without consequence and are in fact justified in doing so by nature, quote unquote. So, like, enter the post-apocalyptic fiction. So, the apocalypse is a really handy narrative convention for sweeping away social strictures and, as you said, wiping the slate clean. So, especially the stuff written in the 50s and 60s before nuclear technology and the consequences of radiation were really well understood. So, nuclear war could just kind of get rid of the centers of power without too much other consequence. Like, sure, there would be like scary animals or maybe other bands of
Ooh, Night of the
humans, but
Lepus.
yeah, but suddenly the post-apocalyptic landscape sort of becomes this place of what this theorist that I used, Gary K. Wolfe, he calls it a world of easily discernible heroes and villains. And there's this clear split between good and evil. And that's really exciting. And it's very reminiscent of the Western sort of like cowboys and Indians genre of literature. And then there's the white man, his homestead, and his family to cater to his needs. And then there's a scary, dangerous other people who are probably like racialized or poor or something terrible.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this all sort of starts to make sense. Okay, as a fantasy, as a genre of fantasy, this all sort of starting to make sense to me.
Mhm.
So okay, I realize that your focus ended in 1989, but do you think the post-apocalyptic stories are still kind of suffer from this? So I'm sort of thinking of two things at the moment. So I'm thinking of George Romero's posthumous zombie apocalypse and post zombie apocalypse novel, The Living Dead, which was really interesting. Which and it has a surprisingly solar punk slash hope punk post zombie apocalypse kind of stuff
Mhm.
going on there. And also, night before last on TV, I happened to be watching The Cloud Atlas,
Oh, Cloud Atlas. Yeah.
which also, I mean, they go to great lengths to make this a much more integrated, much more not just white people
Right.
participating in the story down through the centuries. Their
Right.
sort of post-apocalyptic, sort of kind of weird, complicated story. It was good. I enjoyed it. It finally started to make a little bit of sense to me.
Ah, okay. I actually have never seen it, although like I know about it from all of the hype around it. So,
Oh my God,
I
everybody is in it.
yeah,
Everybody.
oh really?
Even
So
though they give all the actors like 5 roles each, they still somehow manage to have all the actors in there.
interesting. I mean, like my opinion on sci-fi movies is kind of sus, as I mentioned. Not just because like my dissertation research kind of ended at 1989, but also because I just don't watch science fiction movies that
Okay,
much.
but it was
Um,
also a book.
oh, okay, sorry. Uh, um, but we can get into adaptation theory and stuff like that. But like the only post-apocalyptic fiction, like contemporary stuff that I've read have been actually by BIPOC authors, to be honest. So like I'd say it's like definitely not the case that there's still this like colonialist urge for white supremacy, but I might be showing my selection bias in just the books that I read. So the
Okay,
white
so you mean
cis,
like Parable of the Sower?
yeah, yeah, like
Well, but
I,
actually, okay, it's not Canadian, but it does actually fall within your time span.
it does, yeah. But yeah, it's not Canadian. Like Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wabgishi Rice, who's a indigenous author from Canada. And it came out in like 2018, I think.
So the post-apocalyptic genre has made a few strides in recent
Yeah,
years.
yeah, I think so. I mean, I like especially like if you look at the winners of the Hugos from recent years, there's been a lot of writers who are not cis het white male people who maybe write different stories that like that traditional narrative is extremely boring to me, and at times it's like incredibly gross since it assumes a level of like treadway for female subservience that I'm really not okay with and would rather not have in my head. So I just don't read that stuff anymore.
Yeah.
I will come back to it.
Okay. Well, I hear you because I actually stopped reading science fiction when I was 14 and I didn't come back to it until I was in my 30s because I got so disgusted by it.
Sure.
And this brings us to the next question, which is why has science fiction so often suffered from a failure of imagination of the sort where it's totally possible to imagine brave new worlds and people with green skin and amazing new technologies, but impossible to imagine societies that have moved beyond or even just questioned patriarchy, white supremacy, misogyny, colonialism, and capitalism, among other things.
So, Joanna Russ, feminist science fiction critic and writer, she already asked this question back in the 1970s, and I think failure of imagination is actually a phrase that she used. So she caught a lot of flack for bringing this up, but she wasn't wrong. I honestly think it's because so many science fiction writers have grown up unconsciously buying into stereotypes that they take as axioms, such as patriarchy or capitalism, just kind of being the way the world has always worked, or what makes their society possible and a natural outcome of the evolution of culture. Like if you're growing up during the mid-20th century and that's all you've ever known and you've never traveled outside your paradigm, you're going to not have the tools to question it maybe as much as an outsider would. So I wouldn't say it's impossible to imagine these new worlds outside of white supremacy and misogyny, etc., but it can be really hard for writers who have never experienced or talked to anyone who's from like other cultures or places where these aren't truisms. So
I just want to interrupt because I'm like, really? I mean, science fiction writers are paid to imagine things. Or, I mean, at least they used to be paid.
I yes, they used to be paid. But also, I mean, they were paid to imagine certain things, right? Like, you don't exactly want to pay someone to tell you that your culture is shit, right? Like, nobody wants to read that story.
Yeah, but what about Cyberpunk? Which was all about saying that things were shit.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Christina, that is a different episode.
Oh, sorry.
You're getting ahead of yourself.
Sorry.
I will talk about Cyberpunk and yeah, that was kind of the point of Cyberpunk, was pointing out that things are shit, but it was also sort of a continuation of that, you know, like adventurous male white protagonist who, you know, can do all the cool computery things and save all the people and, you know,
Yeah,
has all the
I
knowledge.
guess you had to get to the disillusionment of the late 70s, 1980s before you,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely born of its context. And I guess what I'm arguing in a lot of this is that a lot of science fiction is sort of born of its context. So getting into a little bit of like science fiction genre theory here. So Darko Subin is almost like he's often referred to as the theorist of science fiction. Like he was the first one to put out a book about it. And he was also the first person to treat science fiction as like a serious research-worthy phenomenon that affects and expresses culture, as opposed to just like some silly little thing that kids like. And he writes that science fiction has what he calls a novum, or the novelty or innovation that dominates or presides over the narrative hegemony of the text, and it changes the way that the world works on a scale from like ever so slightly or in a huge way. So like it might be like the novum might be like there's space travel now. And then the entire world kind of like flows from that premise of like, okay, well, if there's space travel now, then how do people tend to think about how they are in transit and like have new things been discovered, that kind of thing? Or it could be that like, you know, like it could be as small as like the protagonist creates this new technology in his basement and the whole story is about him trying to get other people to like believe in this like in his ability to like patent this technology or something like that. So it can be like simple like that, or it can be sort of like it impacts the entire world. And It's
I'm sorry, I'm embarrassed. I actually wrote one of these protagonist attempts to get people to believe that she can patent this thing she invented in her basement kind of
I mean,
stories.
it's not bad. That
Oh,
it's
I thought
not
it was
bad.
so
That's a really
unique,
interesting
though.
story.
I thought it was so unique, though.
It that type of story was actually a lot more prevalent in like the 1950s and 1960s, and actually, well, the 1930s and 1940s science fiction too. Although I didn't do a lot of research, but that was back when like there was a lot of like military technology flooding into popular culture, and a lot of this idea of like the genius mechanic who can sort of like create things because new technologies seem to be being created almost every day. And so it did seem kind of out of the realm of possibility that like some kid in his basement could like come up with like a robot kind of thing, you know?
Or a
Um,
desktop computer.
yeah, exactly. So it was, I mean, very, very plausible. And we kind of moved away from that genre of storytelling more in the 70s and 80s. But it, I mean, you're living proof that that kind of
Oh, it
story
got
is still
rejected.
something
It got
that
rejected. It got rejected.
I mean, I think it captures the imagination. But yeah, that might be part of why it was rejected, is because like the market at one point was saturated with those sorts of stories. Oh, right, I was talking about novum. So like it's easy to write about sort of a tangible nova, like a cool new piece of technology, or like that capacity for like space travel with the spec kind of specs that you encounter in like hard science fiction. Like if you go into like all the technical details, then you don't really have to think about maybe how people relate to it. But it's much more difficult to write about an intangible or unseen nova that nevertheless affects every aspect of life or an entire society without falling into like that dry utopia trap and keeping focus on a character instead of giving into that like world building impulse and just being like, so I'm going to talk to you about this economic system. So hold on for like 200 pages, which does happen in some science fiction, which is not a bad thing. But, you know, maybe not everybody's cup of tea. So my best examples of how this is done right is in Ursula Le Guin's Anarchist Society in like The Dispossessed, because it's about a protagonist from that culture, but it's not about that culture itself. Like the protagonist isn't just like traditional utopian stories were basically an outsider coming into this new culture and going, ooh, ah, as they discover everything sort of new about it and thinking about how it's different from the culture that they're from. And that's not what The Dispossessed is about. You get hints of that world building, but it's not, you know, the dominant narrative.
The protagonist goes and visits a messed up capitalistic society.
Yeah, yeah.
Although
So
honestly, the utopian society does not come out looking pretty.
yeah, no, exactly. And so like it's more ambivalent, you know? And so it's not like there are clear lines between these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, because again, that's just sort of an easy thing to fall into when you're talking about like a nova or the new way that this science fiction world works. If you have good guys and bad guys, then it's really easy to set up conflict and it's really easy to resolve that conflict. And it's like you don't have to do a whole heck of a lot of work, narratively speaking. Samuel R. Delany's Trouble on Triton. I don't know if you've read any of Delany's work, but like he has like non-traditional family structures in there that just completely blew my mind the entire time. But that's not really the point of the novel. I mean, like there's, you know, like obviously like since these family structures are so important to the characters, they are sort of a necessary part of the novel itself, but they're not the main focus, you know, like the conflict isn't about like, you know, oh, like I have sibling, you know, like rivalry or something like that. It's something bigger. It's something else.
You know,
But
I
that's
I
still there.
I picked up his really super famous book in the airport a couple years ago, a year or so ago. You know, the one where like, that's genius, but you won't get it. And I didn't get it. In fact, I never finished it.
I would recommend maybe starting with his short stories. He has a
I've
full
probably read
anthologies.
I've probably read a bunch down through the years. I just
Yeah.
don't remember any. But I also suspect these things were probably much fresher and more innovative and mind-blowing when they were first written.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like the thing is that science fiction, even if it's about the future, is always embedded in its cultural context and in the present. And so it's always going to sort of call out to the reader in the present. And if your present has moved on from that point in time and you're not super knowledgeable about the context in which the book was written, sometimes it's just not going to resonate the same way.
Well, I think, I mean, I think if someone's writing about transgressive or maybe that's not the right word, but really forward-looking social structures or ways of having relationships between people, 45 years later, they're not novel anymore and they're not transgressive anymore. They don't have that power anymore. They just seem like, yeah, so what?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, like if society has moved to sort of like catch up with, quote unquote, that sort of like new idea that idea that was so new back, 40 years ago. Um, yeah, what you said.
Well, anyway, so I think then we've identified some science fiction that didn't fail to have imagination.
Hmm.
But so what's your feeling? Is science fiction getting better at failing to fail to imagine? Is it getting better at not failing to imagine?
Getting better at, yeah, yeah. Um, I think that might be the reason that most solar punk fictions are short stories or novellas right now, because I think they do that. But it's easier to zoom in on and focus on an individual's experience of a completely different society for a short while than to have to spend time in that society fleshing it out in a way that's somehow relatable to readers at the same time it's interesting and relevant to the narrative at hand. Like, I couldn't do it. I would definitely fall into the utopia trap of being like, allow me to sketch out this entire political system, and it would be very boring and dry and bad.
I suppose unless you're a total policy wonk. Um,
Well, maybe.
so how do you think Solarpunk can avoid falling into the same failure of imagination trap as earlier science fiction? Are we, because I feel like sometimes it's dreaming the same dream.
Hmm.
Or do you think it's
Well,
not an issue for Solarpunk?
well, I think, I don't think that writers of solar punk should assume that just by creating within the solar punk genre that they're immune from replicating those harmful structures of thought that lead to the failure of imagination. So internalized misogyny is a thing, as is double consciousness, and that can come
What's
out.
that?
Double consciousness. It was first published in W.B. Du Bois's autoethnographic work, The Souls of Black Folk. So he described the African American experience of double consciousness. So basically, it's that dual self-perception that's experienced by the subordinated or colonized groups within that oppressive society. So yeah, it's always looking at oneself through the eyes of a racist white society and measuring oneself by the means of a nation that looked back in contempt, which is his words. Double consciousness can also be extrapolated to like, say you don't fit the exact beauty standards of the white supremacist patriarchy, and say like you have different facial features. You're always going to be looking at yourself from the point of view of someone who could maybe rate you on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of attractiveness. And you're always going to be down on yourself because you can never measure up to that standard. And so you have sort of that double consciousness. You have your own consciousness, and then you have a consciousness of what other people think about you.
Okay.
And that is negative.
Okay.
Does that explain it?
Yeah. No, I think I understand. But then that starts to be very additive once you're not fitting in by a various number of different lenses. Like if you're female or if you're neurodivergent or I mean and
Future Ariel, here to say that we're here basically describing intersectionality without actually saying the word. Intersectionality was theorized by Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how multiple different identities intersect and can affect the way that people move through the world. For example, being African Canadian and female, or being an Orthodox Jew and queer.
Yeah, I mean, you always have this sneaking suspicion that what you're doing is not the right thing, right? And that is a consciousness that somebody else will be judging you. So you are bringing along someone else within your own mind.
Okay. Remind me, what does this have to do with Solarpunk? Falling into the failure of imagination trap?
Right. Sorry. Just those things tend to come out in fiction, even when maybe like they're subconscious and you don't want them to. So, like for example, the idea of being judged within say your Solarpunk protagonist is neurodivergent. Within society as it is today, they would always be thinking, oh, what I'm doing is not correct, or what I am doing might be different from how other people would act in this situation, and have fears about interacting with other people, that sort of thing.
So
they wouldn't I'm not saying that every single neurodivergent person today feels like that.
No, yeah, but so the pressure comes from the way they've been treated by other people when they failed to fit into the definition of how these other people see them.
Yes,
Okay.
precisely. And so in a Solarpunk world, you would imagine that this person has grown up without feeling those pressures. And so they wouldn't be having those sorts of internal thoughts. They would just be living their lives. And because neurodivergence would be accommodated for within the Solarpunk society.
Okay, so writing this stuff takes more than just imagining an alternative, but really, really understanding how different people would be if they didn't grow up in the confinement of the situations we have today.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it depends on your type of Solarpunk story. Like, if your Solarpunk story is set in a very near future, like where society is just sort of newly transformed into this Solarpunk world, or transforming in the process of becoming better, then maybe your protagonist will have grown up with those sorts of thoughts, and maybe that's going to be a part and parcel of their characterization. However, if you're setting it in a far future where the world has been this purportedly Solarpunk place that is accepting of everybody, and like for generations, your main character maybe won't have that consciousness. That's maybe an anachronism that is being brought into that story. I find that's the kind of thing that tends to pull me out, honestly.
What do you mean pull you out? Pull you out of the story?
Yeah, pull me out of a story. Yeah.
I was just thinking of the series of books by Cage Baker, or Kaj, I actually don't know how she said her name. That started with In the Garden of Eden, and they were about these people who, and they were very, very old, and they had been fixed up so that they would never die, but then they had to work for this corporate overlord kind of company. And the first several books are fantastic, and then then it all kind of it jumps the shark, as it were. But there's this one character who keeps popping up over and over again in different centuries, because he's kind of some sort of experimental prototype, blah 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 blah. And there's at one point where he gets revived several centuries after the 16th century, I think it is, and he has a very hard time adjusting because the social mores or mores, or here's another word we don't agree on how it's pronounced. Just the whole way of looking at the world and morality is so completely changed, and I think this is a very good example of characters who, you have to think about how they would see the world when they are raised in a completely different set of cultural values.
Yeah. Your original question about how can Solarpunk avoid falling into the same failure of imagination trap, I would say, like, share your work if you're a Solarpunk writer, like get as many eyes on it as possible. just especially from people who have had a different experience of life than you have had. And they might have their own perspectives on Nova that the writer might not be able to see from their own vantage point.
Future Ariel popping in here to mention that if an author is not comfortable sharing their work at the stage that it's at, I'd recommend checking out a few autobiographies of people from different walks of life from their local library. Reading those could cast a bit more perspective on characters within the writer's Solarpunk setting.
Well, there's so much that we take for granted, or that we don't realize, or that we live in this milieu, and there's so much that we just imagine that's just the way it is.
Exactly.
And this is the failure of imagination. This is the we don't even see what's holding us back, and we don't even see some of the things that are just fundamentally wrong with the way we do things now and the way we think about things now. And so, yeah, Solarpunk has to break out of that and somehow see from a different perspective than we're all living in, and that is tricky. Yeah, but on the other hand, I think part of what Solarpunk and the people who are interested in Solarpunk and all the woke people, or all the people who are trying to wake up, this is part of that interrogation of language that we use, that, we shouldn't say that word anymore, and that's a terrible way to look at it, and we shouldn't just automatically gender people. And so I guess this is part of breaking out of that failure of imagination as a society.
Yeah. And being able to sort of really truly imagine otherwise, as opposed to just, we have space travel to Jupiter, but
we haven't changed the way we think about things.
Yeah, the protagonist comes back to his wife and kids who are at in the home.
Where's my dinner?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's 5 o'clock. Dinner should be on the table.
Yeah, that's an example I took straight from, I think, probably Joanna Russ. That was a major complaint of second wave feminisms and science fiction feminisms and feminists who wrote science fiction. They were like, well, there's all this cool technology, but in terms of social relations, there's no real innovation. There's nothing has changed.
I'm poaching the plural reference to science fiction feminisms from Helen Merrick's fantastic book Secret Feminist Cabal about the history of feminism in science fiction.
Okay. You just assume that these hierarchies will persist into the future no matter what happens. And I think that Solarpunk is really an exercise in trying to disrupt that and imagine otherwise, and create the possibility that actually those things maybe won't persist into the future, and what might that look like?
And that's a wrap for this episode, but we will have an associated bonus clip of about half an hour coming soon, if not already, depending on what day it is when you're listening to this. So be sure to look for that on our website or on our YouTube channel or on Patreon, because it'll also be on Patreon. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel Kroon and Christina De La Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay Solarpunk.